Well, thank you for inviting me back. Just to clear up any misunderstanding at the beginning, I think maybe some of you expected I was going to talk about my role in UK politics, but I am now retired. I'm doing other things. And I'm actually going to talk about this book that I published recently. It's called Money and Power, which is about the link between economics and politics. I'm happy in questions to, digress on, my role in British politics, if that's what you like. But I'm going to basically summarize what I'm saying in this book. And it derives partly from my own background, that I spent half my professional life as an economist in industry and government and academia, and the other half in politics as a local councillor and candidate and MP, and eventually in the cabinet. And so I got increasingly fascinated by this issue of how economic policy is actually made. And economic policy is very rarely made by economists, it's made by politicians. There are qualifications to that. The people who sit on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England are, of course, are trained economists, but they operate within a framework which the Chancellor of the Exchequer and government has decided, the same with the Federal Reserve. And I think it is broadly true in almost every area that it is actually politicians who make economic policy. And it's therefore important to understand, I think, where they come from. And one of the things which is very striking when you're in the middle of it, as a politician involved in economic policy, is the way that politicians tend to see the world in different ways and make different assumptions. I'll just give a few simple examples. We very often say that the purpose of policy is, quote, to save jobs. We will lose so many jobs if we leave the European Union, to take a topical example, or we will save so many jobs if we intervene to save this factory. Whereas economists will, of course, point out that you don't save jobs. There is no such thing as a lump of labour. It's not a fixed supply. It depends on overall demand, and it depends on, in technical terms, the elasticity of supply. In other words, people's capacity to change, to train, to adapt. It's a different way of looking at the world. Similarly, it's usually the case in the political world that a trade surplus is seen as a good thing, and the trade deficit is seen as a problem and a bad thing. Well, of course, an economist would turn the whole thing upside down and say, of course, if you're running a trade deficit, it means that your citizens are able to consume more than they otherwise would. It's a positive, not a negative. And indeed, we come back to that question repeatedly throughout economic history, and I'll give examples of it. And to choose a last example, which often arose, some of you may remember, the days of Margaret Thatcher, who often was, rather criticised for indulging in what was called Housewives Economics. It's a somewhat patronising way of talking about it, but she was in the habit of saying, if everybody saved a bit more, the country would be in a better state. Well, economists, of course, rush to point out that that's actually wrong, that there is a fallacy of composition, that if everybody saves, you get into depression and recession. So those are a few examples, and those of you who do PPE will be very familiar with the distinction between normative and positive economics, that the basic economics is about if X, then Y, and normative economics is let's have more Y. It's a different way of looking at the world. But I'm talking about the problem in rather abstract terms, but what I've done in this book is I've taken 16, that's a rather arbitrary number, of important historical figures, politicians, one or two of whom were economically trained, but most of whom weren't, but who actually made a big difference to the way the world operated in economic terms, economic policy terms. Just before I give a few examples, just to qualify that slightly, these are not necessarily, I'm not necessarily making a judgment as to whether these are good or bad people. Actually, one of my 16 is President Trump, not because I'm a great fan of President Trump, but because I think the things he did in economic terms, and particularly economic nationalism and America First approach to policy, are actually transformative, and they are enduring and doing a great deal of harm, and they matter. So my examples are chosen from people because they mattered, because they made a big difference. I'm also making the assumption that you can look at history in terms of individuals. I mean, I know there is a school of historical thought, E.H. Carr and others you probably study, who disparage this way of looking at historical events and will say it's all down to underlying structural trends and demographics and social forces. But I'm rather contradicting that, and I'm singling out particular individuals because they're interesting and because they made a difference. And I'll start with the three that I took from the 19th century. And I started with Alexander Hamilton, who probably is the most important political figure in the last 2 centuries in terms of his impact on economic policy. Some of you may have seen the musical and know the sort of dramatic story around his life and his opposition to slavery and his role in the American War of Independence. But he actually is one of the founding fathers who almost certainly should have become president after Washington, but he kept picking feuds with Madison and Jefferson, with the other leading personalities of the time, and lost out. But he, nonetheless, in terms of his influence on history, made up for it with some remarkably radical, innovative changes, some of which have endured to this day. First of all, he introduced fiscal federalism, which a slightly clumsy way of putting the combining of the debts of the different American states to create a unified economy. Naturally, this is what the European Union is trying to do today. This is the current attempts to create European-backed debt is exactly what Hamilton tried to do at the beginning of the 19th century. He understood before anybody else that public debt needs never to be repaid. And he created a market for public debt, a bond market. And the bond market went up and down. People speculated. People hated him for it because some people were making a lot of money, others were losing. But nonetheless, it created for the first time a system by which governments could systematically borrow in capital markets. And it's, of course, endured to this day. He set up the first national bank in the United States, which ultimately became the Federal Reserve. And most important of all, he made the case for protecting manufacturing industry. It was a very novel concept at the time because he had been brought up around the ideas of Adam Smith, but he thought his way through it and saw that for the United States, there had to be a breakout from the dependency that the United States had, and he argued in a very logical and careful way for what we now call infant industry protection. And on the back of his arguments, the United States established its first textile mills and the beginnings of industrialization in America, which, of course, endured and ultimately, of course, led to the North winning the Civil War. It was on the back of the manufacturing industry that he generated in the North. So he was a really transformative political figure, and it was an example of a politician who had no particular background in economic thinking, massively influencing the way that economic policy was made. My second example was British, which was Peel. Those you'll remember from your history. 1840s, a British prime minister, conservative, the first, I think, genuinely conservative prime minister. The previous were called Tories. He created the Tory party. And he was, for most of his life, a thoroughgoing reactionary, I mean, by any standards. I mean, he led the battle to stop Catholics voting. He presided as Home Secretary over a system of jurisprudence which led to, I think, 400 different capital punishments. He wasn't, by modern standards, a progressive figure at all. And he went into the 1840s committed to protectionism of agriculture, because that was where the Tory party's interest lay, in protecting the interests of farmers, landowners. But in the course of the 1840s, under pressure from the street, from campaigning and his own conversion, was persuaded to adopt the doctrine of free trade, getting rid of the Corn Laws, admitting grain to Britain and to Ireland, which was simultaneously undergoing a particularly appalling famine. And in the course of it, he became a working class hero, which first conservative to do so. There's maybe a certain amount of symmetry with what the President Prime Minister is trying to do. But from traditionally being the party of the landlords, became the hero of the urban workers. He also split his party in the process. The Conservatives were out of office for most of the next 20 years, and the Liberals, in partnership with his dissident Conservative allies, ran the country. But it was a highly significant decision on economic policy taken by a politician for political reasons, which actually created the framework for British policy for pretty much the next 170 years. I mean, there have been odd lapses into protectionism in Britain, in Chamberlain before the First World War, Baldwin to some extent in the 30s. But for the most part, Britain has been committed to an open, free trading economy, and that was Peel. And my third 19th century example was Bismarck, who you'd never think of normally in economic policy terms. He wasn't interested in economics. That was dismissed, anybody who talked about finance, a boring subject. He was also in some ways rather unpleasant individual, very militaristic, very nationalistic, initially for Prussia and then for United Germany. And he was, in almost any terms, a pretty conservative politician. The king of Prussia, the Kaiser, described him as the most reactionary member of a reactionary class, the Junkers. But nonetheless, this man made three big changes to economic policy, which have endured in different ways and of enormous importance, one of which was introducing the concept of a customs union, the Zollverein, which he used to unify Germany, the Prussia with the small states of the south, and to create an external tariff to keep out products from countries that you didn't want, which in this case was Austria. And it served his political purposes, but it became a template for future economic integration projects, of which the European Common Market is the present day. His second big change was he could reasonably claim long before Beveridge and indeed the 1906 Liberal government in Britain to have introduced the welfare state. I mean, he hated communists, socialists, anybody representing the working class, but he was he was a very strong sense of self-interest and political expediency, and he realized that if the German interests he represented were going to survive, he would have to make concessions, and he brought in social insurance for pensions, unemployment, sickness. It was a revolutionary idea at the time, and it has formed the basis for welfare state policies pretty much ever since. And the third thing he did was probably captured in his catchphrase, blood and iron, was the protection of heavy industry. What ultimately became the industrial complex in Germany, chemicals and steel. And he was actually a free trader. He went the opposite way from Peel, but he was persuaded to adopt protectionist ideas, created a wall of protection around German heavy industry, which formed the basis for German modernization, you could argue ultimately for the First World War. But he was the father of that approach to manufacturing industry and for the protection of new industries. Now, I think in all these three cases, you have a phenomenon which was once described by John Maynard Keynes when he said that all practical men of affairs, and of course there were mostly men in those days, all practical men of affairs are slaves of some defunct economists. And in the three cases I've mentioned, I suspect that the politicians in question were not aware of whose ideas they were borrowing, but they were. And in the case of Bismarck, he was drawing on the ideas of somebody called Friedrich List, who in turn had developed ideas on the back of what Hamilton had done in the United States. Peel was undoubtedly animated by the ideas of Ricardo and Adam Smith many years before. And they formed part of the kind of intellectual received wisdom on which he drew. And Hamilton was ultimately a free market man. He'd read Adam Smith and believed in it, but he also had read widely on the French thinking about mercantilism, as it was called, and he used that to justify the protection of manufacturing industry. When we got into the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we had, of course, a new world, the First World War, the end of globalization, the major crises within the capitalist system. And there were some big new economic ideas. And it's interesting to reflect on the politicians who created them and used them. And my very simplistic way of describing it was that there were two big bad ideas and one good one. The big bad ideas were communism and fascism. And I have a chapter devoted to Lenin. And it's probably more sympathetic than you might imagine, given my overall approach to things. But Lenin, in his early period, did bring in war communism. It was a chaotic period. There was massive destruction, famine, and partly as a result of the conflict, but partly as a result of attempting to impose a new communist model on a pre-existing society, had dramatically negative consequences. But the real importance of Lenin in terms of thinking about economics was that when he saw the consequences of what was happening in Russia, he changed course. And in 1921, he introduced the new economic policy, which was the use of markets to deal with the relationship, particularly between agriculture and industry. Liberating small business and peasant farmers. And there was an enormous transformation, a very quick transformation in Russia, Soviet Union at the time. He didn't live long enough to see it, but in the next few years, the Soviet Union was really starting to motor in economic terms. Of course, Stalin then changed course again. But Lenin, in his time, was responsible for a major economic transformation. Now, you could say, well, the Soviet Union's gone, it's all gone to waste. But actually it didn't, because there was one person who was around in Soviet Union at the time as an overseas student, which was Deng Xiaoping. He had left China, worked in France, been expelled from France because of his revolutionary activities, or fled, and gone to the Soviet Union and saw the NEP. And many of the ideas which China later adopted through Deng, he picked up from what was happening in the new economic policy. So it had enduring importance. Fascism was a less organized and coherent set of thoughts. I mean, of course, there was the nationalism, the racism, all those things. But fascism, fascist economics, is a subject that slightly sort of died out. We don't think about it anymore. It sort of lingered in the post-war era in Spain and Portugal in a sort of fairly low-key way. But the ideas of fascist economics were carried forward by an interesting individual, Juan Perón in Argentina. And Peronism, which is a mixture, an amalgamation of some different ideas, but started with his admiration for Mussolini and the fascist model in Europe, it's a very strange set of ideas which have been economically calamitous, but have nonetheless been endlessly repeated. There have been 6 Peronist presidents, all of whom have finished up in the same dire state, based on a belief that you had to protect your industry, even though it was very inefficient. Argentina was not a big country, raising costs enormously, based on trying to co-opt trade unions into the state, which was part of sort of Mussolini's thinking originally, and with a very imaginative approach to financing budgets. I mean, you just printed money, leading to hyperinflation, which has happened over and over again in Argentina. And Perón is interesting because he was one of the few people who saw fascism, or it's the economic side of fascism, and tried to apply it in his own country. Now, the third idea, which, and I'm being rather normative and political here, would say was a good idea, was Keynesian economics coming from FDR, from Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I have a chapter on Roosevelt, but I don't take the conventional view about Roosevelt. There's people who often talk about the New Deal today. We hear a lot about the Green New Deal and why doesn't the government run bigger deficits, and praise for Biden's deficit policy on the basis that it's, quote, Keynesian and it's derived from the New Deal. Well, actually, it wasn't. The New Deal was a highly interventionist approach to the crisis in America in 1932, which was very deep. It was much worse than anything in modern times. They had a collapse of the economy by 30%. They had an enormous amount of unemployment, got up to 20% at one point. But there was an enormous amount of intervention. But Roosevelt actually was a passionate believer in balanced budgets. He didn't believe in Keynes at all, thought it was nonsense. And it was only much later in his presidency, when they'd had a second recession in 1937, that he was persuaded by what are now called American Keynesians, people like Alvin Hansen, to change course. The other point about Roosevelt, which is salutary to remember, is that he was single-minded. He achieved a phenomenal amount, but he did it by being focusing on one issue only. He had some very unsavory political allies in driving through his economic program. The segregationists in the Deep South were part of his army, effectively, his political army, and he never questioned them. He just accepted that to get things done, he had to ally with them. But Roosevelt's legacy, of course, was what we now understand as Keynesian economics, a much more active government intervention, a willingness for government to invest, borrow to invest, and Bretton Woods, which was creating a system of rules within the international system for trade and investment flows. And then, last of all, we come to the post-war era, and I have several characters who represent what would seem to me to be the main big new ideas which politicians brought in the post-war period. And the two main one was social democracy, which was the belief that you could combine big government, welfare state, generous government spending, high levels of taxation, that you could combine that with an open economy. And the example I used was not a household name, but a man called Erlander, who was the Prime Minister of Sweden, the longest-serving Swedish Prime Minister, who created probably the best example of a functioning welfare state in modern economy, isn't it? Lingers in Sweden. The Social Democrats have lost some support, but they're still in government. And the Swedish model was copied pretty much in Finland and Denmark, Norway, there are different variations, but the social democratic model proved to be one of the main legacies of the Swedish Social Democrats, who drew on the ideas of Keynes, of Myrdal, who you may have come across, a Swedish economist, and others. So that was one. The second, with what people now call pejoratively neoliberalism, but it's sort of free market economics, returning to the basic principles of the classical thinkers like Adam Smith, which we tend to think of in the UK as being produced by Margaret Thatcher and her government and Reagan in the United States. But actually the first and the most powerful strand was introduced by Erhard in Germany after the Second World War. Erhard inherited the Nazi structures, demolished them, essentially made a bonfire of controls. He believed passionately in free markets, but a particularly German approach to free markets, which was called ordoliberalism, in which you have unrestricted competition, but you also have strong government, not to spend money, which he deplored, but to have a set of rules and to have monetary stability. And when you look at the contribution Germany now makes to the European Union and the thinking of the monetary union particularly, the ordoliberal tradition which Erhard brought in is still very live. So the second of the big ideas was liberalism, economic liberalism, which came partly through Mrs. Thatcher, partly through Erhard. And the third was what I would call the development state. The idea that the state has a role, a pragmatic role, using markets, but using the power of government to make a complete transformation from underdevelopment to development. And the pioneers of this way of thinking were in Japan in the 19th century, the Meiji dynasty. There's no individual there, so I had no individual to write about. It was a sort of collective thinking built around the emperor. But the ideas of the Meiji dynasty were then adopted post-war by General Park in Korea. And in many ways, he was the pioneer of the modern version of the development state. A pretty brutal military man, very intolerant of political opposition, chief power in a coup d'etat, was eventually assassinated. It wasn't a softie by any means. But he forced through the industrialization of one of the poorest countries in the world. It's now one of the richest, and it's also a democracy after his departure. But it was done through an aggressive state deciding that we are going to have certain industries, which in the case of Korea were iron and steel and the car industry, the chemical industry, and eventually consumer electronics, Samsung that we got today. That concept of the development state was really pioneered in Korea, and I have a chapter on Park. And my other example, I'll try and draw my remarks to a close in a few minutes. My other example, and probably the most important figure in post-war history, actually, in terms of economic thinking, was Deng Xiaoping in China. And I mentioned how he started his thinking. He was a sort of communist revolutionary at various stages, number 2 to Mao. He had fluctuating fortunes. He was outlawed in the Cultural Revolution, had a pretty tough experience. His son was thrown from upper stories of a building and broke his back. He had a pretty hard time. But he was a ruthless communist and uncompromising in his politics, had no truck whatever with democracy, and was, by his own admission, the author of the Tiananmen Square massacre. But he was totally committed to the idea of modernizing China economically, and was willing to do whatever needed to be done. And that meant opening China to new ideas, to learn lessons from overseas, to absorb technology, to have competitive trade, to let markets fluctuate for peasant farmers who had hitherto been repressed. It was sort of market economics mixed up with Marxism, sort of eclectic mixture. And it was brilliantly successful. And pretty much for 4 decades, the first under Deng himself and then under his successors, has transformed China into the economic superpower it is today. And there's a big argument about whether China's economy is now bigger than the United States. It probably is. And about hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in this process. And Deng actually deserves the credit for that. I mean, I'm well aware of the political ramifications, but as a politician conducting economic policy, he was a sort of heroic figure, actually. So I'd just like to conclude with the present time. Now, people sometimes ask, what are the big new economic ideas in the world today? What are they? Where do they come from? And I think there are probably 2 which have had real influence. One is what is sometimes called Abenomics. Abe was a kind of time-serving Japanese politician, not particularly impressive man in many ways, but he was one of the longest-serving Japanese prime ministers since the Second World War. And under him, all kind of highly unorthodox but highly effective economic policies were introduced. One was quantitative easing, which of course has become the key element in Western economies, but it started in Japan under his leadership, or at least he was the prime minister when the central bank introduced it. And he also, or his advisors, with his leadership, certainly understood the idea of debt deflation, which is probably the main problem we suffer from today, or since the financial crisis, with governments and companies laden with debt and tending to lead their economies into recession unless the government counters it with very big spending and willingness to run up large amounts of public debt. And that was the essence of Abenomics. And it kept Japan, which could have suffered the most appalling depression after the collapse of its banking system in 1990, kept Japan pretty much out of the mire, and it's provided examples for the rest of the world. And my other example of a big new idea, which has had ramifications, is Trump. I think a particularly deplorable individual in many ways, but he had a very clear view, almost certainly economic nonsense, but highly influential, that what really matters are bilateral deficits in trade. And you wage war against other countries which have the temerity to run trade surpluses. And he led the United States into trade conflicts with Europe and Japan and almost everywhere else, and particularly with China. And the trade war with China has set the tone for this increasingly acrimonious new Cold War, which is developing with China. And Biden, whatever things he's changed, and he's changed many things for the better, he has continued with Trump's economic policy with hardly a change. So that's where we are today. Happy to pursue discussion with you on any of those points or on some of the political questions, which I know your president has stored up. But thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Simmons, for a very, very interesting and insightful speech. We'll go straight into the audience questions. If you just want to raise your hand, the way in which this will work is that when the microphone comes to you, you can remove your face mask to ask the question. So yeah, just hands up. Any audience questions? We'll start with just over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Simmons, for your whistle-stop tour on all those economic leaders. It's especially helpful for a PP finalist who's about to sit the exam on economic history. Particularly, I'm interested in the later half of the 20th century. especially the period after 1979, especially in the 1980s. If we look at the global economy, Thatcherite economics, Deng Xiaoping, China's open reform, and Reagan economics, they all have a key focus on market liberalization. Do you think is there a common driving force behind this change in economics? And why is this change able to be a global phenomenon? Or do you think this is just coincidental?
Yes, there was a lot of copying going on. People were borrowing each other's ideas. I mean, a key influence on modern thinking, which applied as much to Margaret Thatcher as it did to Deng Xiaoping, were people like Milton Friedman, who made the case for free market economics and monetarist policy. And Deng admitted to having been influenced by him every bit as much as the so-called neoliberals in Europe. But Deng was very eclectic, was not doctrinaire in any sense whatever. He started by acknowledging that probably the main source of ideas which he was going to draw on came from Japan. And that, you know, in a way, Japan's history, particularly in the late 19th century, was the model for successful Asian development. So he drew on a lot of Japanese ideas. And there was a leading American economist who was very fashionable when I was an undergraduate, but I suspect few of you have now heard of him, called Walt Rostow, who was Kennedy's economic advisor. And his ideas, which are about hyper-growth, having a breakthrough, getting 10% growth a year, it's an unheard of concept, had a major influence on the Chinese leadership and also on the Koreans. So there were ideas coming in from different directions. And in terms of the timing and the coincidence, of course, Deng was leading China into his reforms at the same time that the East Europeans were using many of the same ideas to move out of the communist system. And one of my chapters is devoted to a man called Balcerowicz, who was the finance minister of Poland, who led the so-called Big Bang reforms, which were highly successful, and the reason why Poland is now probably the most successful of the former communist countries in Eastern Europe. But the significance about Deng was that, of course, whereas the market reforms in Europe were taken to get away from communism, he retained the political paramountcy of the Communist Party because he believed, and you know, there's some justification, I suppose, that China needed stability, it needed a framework, it needed discipline in order that the economic policies could be implemented. And of course now Xi Jinping is taking his ideas to a higher degree of Communist Party control. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question. Just this question.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. You spoke at the beginning about the Hamiltonian moment for America when there was fiscal federalism. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the prospects of that for Europe and whether that would be, like they've tried to do with the Corona bonds last year, but whether that would be the moment for European federalization, or do you think it would come more from a military threat of Russia or something like that?
Yeah. Well, you know, there always have been Euro-optimists and Euro-pessimists. And actually, the Euro-optimists have invariably won. People have constantly been predicting that the new initiatives taken by the European Union are bound to fail. But they never do, actually. They survive. I was around in debates when the euro was launched. And very few people in the UK gave it the slightest chance of succeeding for more than a few years or even a few months. But it survived and succeeded. It's still there. You can argue it's got structural faults, but it's survived. And the issue of common European debt, which is now being used to finance investment in Italy and Spain and Greece particularly, is a brave new departure. This is Hamiltonian. And it's, so far, the markets appear to be happy to take European-based bonds. The southern European countries appear to be taking it very seriously. Greece is now the poster boy of Europe in terms of its economic policy and the projects it's putting forward. There is a certain amount of optimism that Draghi in Italy will produce good projects on the back of this common European initiative. So whether I think it will lead, I think it probably will lead, despite a lot of grumbling and foot dragging by northern European countries, it probably will lead to bigger and bigger common European fiscal programs. I mean, you could argue that's ultimately why the British left, because we weren't willing to follow the European unity in greater and greater depth. But I think now that, particularly now that Britain has left, and particularly as the other Eurosceptic countries like Denmark are now sort of fully committed to the European project, I think this new initiative with common bonds will succeed and be expanded.
Awesome, thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none.
Do you think it's possible, while we're talking about sort of European economic federalism, for there to be an increase in economic federalism in Europe without an increase in the political federalism in Europe? And something obviously in Brexit, there was sort of discussions about we don't want a president of Europe. Do you think that's something that could come out of this increased economic unity?
If I think I heard you correctly, no, I think fiscal integration is inevitable, because it's the only way, ultimately, you can make the monetary union work. And in a way, that was Hamilton's insight in the United States. He was, with George Washington and Madison, trying to create a country. And it had a common money, but it was only going to work if there was a sharing of tax revenue and a sharing of debt and fiscal transfers between one part of the country and another. And in the modern United States, which is, it is a federal country, the transfers are about 40 times as large as within the European Union. And that's how federal systems work. When one part of the country goes down, you get an automatic transfer from the stronger areas. And that's built into the system. And if you don't have it, then you have the kind of crisis situation that we had in the Eurozone in the earlier part of the decade, that all the burden of adjustment is put on the weaker countries. And to get around that, you've got to have transfers. And to have transfers, you've got to have a common fiscal policy. So we are going to see, more and more emphasis on European taxation and European debt. If it doesn't happen, then I'm afraid the euro crisis is going to come back again in a particularly disastrous form.
Thank you. Any further questions? No? I actually have a question. To sort of jump away from your book and the topic of it, I've got some questions about the coalition government in particular. When you look back at the time when, for the first time in a very long time, if not ever, the UK was in a coalition, or we had a coalition government, do you look back with fondness, or what are your sort of thoughts and feelings about it?
Well, I don't look back with fondness, because it was quite a difficult time, but I think it was politically and economically necessary. And there's a lot of kind of retrospective wisdom, but actually, if you look back carefully at the conditions back in 2010, something like it had to happen. From a political point of view, the 2010 election was particularly wicked, that it created an arithmetic that made it very difficult to form a stable government. I mean, I said publicly many times at the time, and indeed when I was in government, that I would personally have been much more comfortable having a coalition with the Labour Party. But the problem was that they didn't have enough seats. And to form a stable coalition of the left, as opposed to with the Tories, we'd have had to have not just the Labour Party and the small parties, we'd have had to have the Scottish Nationalists, which would have really been a problem, I think, given their agenda, and also the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland, who, in a way, held the Tory government hostage. It would have been very difficult to get the arithmetic. Now, there were people who said, well, why didn't you just give them a supply and confidence arrangement for a few months and just let the Tories do all the nasty stuff? But the problem is we judged, and you may think this is wrong, but we did judge, that if we'd done that, the Tories would have gone back for a second general election in a few months' time. They said, look, we've got these unreliable Liberals and all the other people preventing us doing these things that have to be done. Give us a majority. And I'm convinced they would have got a landslide. So politically, I don't think we had any choice but to form a coalition, uncomfortable though it was. Economically, there was a real crisis in the country. There was a real sense that we were potentially in the same kind of league as Greece. Of course, the difference is we had a flexible exchange rate, they didn't. But nonetheless, it was a very difficult time. And the reason was that Britain had much larger deficits in its budget than other Western countries. And the reason for that was that we had a much bigger banking system. And so when the banking collapse occurred, the impact on the government was all the much greater. So we had a more vulnerable economy than others. Interest rates at that time were not like now, zero. So government could just borrow, you can now. At that stage, it was 3 to 4% long-term interest rates, and they would have escalated. We would have had a very serious public debt problem. So the government had to embrace what is currently called austerity. My view, we had no choice. And also, it was very clear that the Labour government, had they survived, had the plan to do exactly the same. So all the people who are now rewriting history and say, well, you didn't need to do it and it was the wrong thing to have done. Actually, if you position yourself in the conditions that we had at the beginning of the coalition, I believe we had no alternative but to go down the route we did. And the Liberal Democrats, I think, I was part of it, we very substantially moderated what the Tories were doing. I can give you lots of examples, bad things that we stopped. And we also did a lot of good things, pupil premium in education, the lifting of the tax threshold for low-paid workers, many things which I was proud of having contributed to.
Yeah. And on that, as a last question, you've had over 20 years in politics. What are you most proud of having achieved throughout your political?
Well, actually, the thing that I'm proud of, I've taken a lot of brickbats for the things that I was responsible for in the coalition, but actually the things that I delivered as part of our team, I am proud of, actually. When I was in opposition, I said a lot of things people have quoted, and people said it was a very clever speech and all that kind of thing. But actually, what matters in politics ultimately is what you do. What I did in the economic job that I had in government was, first of all, I oversaw some pretty fundamental reforms in the banking system. I had to work with Osborne to do it, but we did it. We split the banks, a sort of British version of the Glass-Steagall Amendment. We did it. I introduced an industrial strategy, which worked and was massively helpful for British pharmaceuticals, for the car industry, the aerospace industry, and others. I brought in the Catapult Network, which has created these innovation centres around the country. And I set up a couple of state banks, one of which, the Green Investment Bank, the Tories sold off, regrettably. We need it for green investment now. The other one, the British Business Bank, did survive, and it's been used as the main channel for financing business during this pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sir Vince. Please join me in thanking